are some of the biggest challenges they face during migration?
One of the biggest challenges actually with the customer that I'm working with is surprisingly just getting access to other systems. Their use cases, they're aggregating a bunch of data, doing analysis on that data using some, agents, LLM, chatbots, things like that. Not only do they need to sync the data, but they also need to sync the authorization data, bring it in OSO. Because they want to make sure that someone's doing all this analysis on this data lake. They don't have extra privileges in this system that they don't have in any of the upstream systems. So it needs to kind of merge all the authorization data, but getting access to that data in the first place, they've already gotten permission to access the data itself, but the authorization data is separate. The group membership, the role membership, things like that. Actually mapping it won't actually be too bad. It's just like data transformations, but even just getting access to it, because it's not something people normally think about, right? It's usually kind of like built into the application, especially if it's like a third-party off-the-shelf thing. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. Surprisingly, it wasn't really a technical one. It was more interacting with all these upstream teams.
One of the biggest challenges, especially in a legacy system, is trying to understand the line between what is authorization logic and data and what is just application logic and data. Especially in systems where these things have sort of organically grown over time, there's not always a clear and obvious distinction. And so there's a certain level of judgment calls that you just have to make.
Sometimes the judgment calls are what is the methodology that we use? It's does it only affect authorization decisions, or does it affect things that happen in the application that's not authorization? But sometimes you start with one decision, and then one of the things you often have to do when doing a migration from a legacy system is measuring consistency or parity between what decision the old system made and what decision the new system makes. And sometimes just being able to measure that decision and what is measurable can also guide what you call authorization logic and what you don't call authorization logic.
Yeah, I think it's sort of also just generally forming the right mental model from going from the world that you were in to this new world that you're trying to get to, and almost understanding that the world that you want to get to is the right one, but trying to forge the right path to get there is actually more kind of convoluted than it might seem to begin with, especially when you're dealing with like we said earlier, logic which is sort of fragmented at different layers, and you're trying to now centralize all of this into a single a single point. Trying to achieve parity between the old one and the new one isn't necessarily a super clear path, and it's all super critical. So which is you kind of want to do it carefully as you do it.
What do you suggest? Do you suggest a rollout strategy that's in bits instead of all together? Or do you suggest having multiple points where you do testing to see if the policy coverage is the same, or if there's regression and whatnot?
Yeah, I'd love to hear what everyone else did, but in our situation, I approached it taking sort of the vertical of the authorization system. So I'd take the user can view a particular resource, and then trying to get parity with that across the entirety of the application first, before I then went on to edit, and approaching it sort of incrementally like that. Was the approach I went with. Is that what you guys?
That's yeah. I broke it down the same way, and I was always happy to hear that we approach this problem independently in the same way. There's it's 100 different endpoints, and the simplest way you can break it down and parallelize it, or just break it down into individually doable tasks, is one endpoint at a time. Often each endpoint corresponds to one permission, so that's one permission at a time. Sometimes different permissions reuse the same logic that other ones did. Sometimes they don't. And then there's often there's 2 or 3 or 4 different like types of patterns of how authorization is being applied. Maybe it's at the API level, and then sometimes there's like authorization happening at the data access level, or like sometimes it's a Boolean decision in one place and like a filtering data question in another place. And you kind of identify like a few abstractions that will help you apply it across the code base, and then you have like a pretty tractable task across the app surface, basically.
Yeah, I would say mapping domains seems like the hardest part, where, what do these words even mean? What does a role mean for you? What does a group mean for you? Or even, do you have those names? But one of the things that I'm noticing in the greenfield system, because a lot of this analysis is downstream too, and not really a critical path for live traffic, is that the fact that if there isn't a rule where we can prove that someone should have access, it denies. So we feel more comfortable saying, okay, we're going to guess at this one, and confirm with you, this user is in this group, has this role, has this permission, means this. We're going to put that in the policy, and that's the only way someone can have permission. And then as we run into situations where it's like, oh, actually, if they're in this workspace, then they should also have permission. If the group's associated with some other group, they should also have permission. We can kind of add those as we go, but not worry that we added too much at the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's kind of but I don't, I think mapping to those domains of what does this word actually mean here.
Yeah.
Found something called lots, and does that mean, is that a permissions thing?
I've seen so many different, like we have like roles and permissions are like the things that we usually talk about, and then I've seen so many different nouns refer to like similar things. I've seen a code base where they use the word permission to describe what we would call a role, and then they have actual permissions that those permissions give.
What do they call those?
I don't think they had a name for it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like permissions, roles, privileges, capabilities.
Yeah, we were
So many different nouns.
Yeah, we would refer to like roles as user groups and that sort of thing.
And one of the things that can make this whole problem of needing to match the logic to what it used to do more doable and less scary is just not really having the goal of right off the bat actually enforcing the new authorization solution, but rather start out by getting to production with measuring how close you are to making the same decisions that the old system made. There's the guy from GitHub, his name's Rick Bradley, I think. Talks about like how whenever you're doing legacy code migrations, one of the good first steps is just to measure what the old system is doing, and once you start putting a new system in place, you can start measuring like how close you are to the intended solution.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.